in that year, he's becoming increasingly involved in pacifist activism as well. But whilst so doing, he took a very overtly nationalistic, really ultra-patriotic stance. So I suppose he wanted to show that a gay Jew could also be a good German. But in 1916, publishes a report called The Psychology of War, about the trauma and the suffering the conflict would cause. Spoke, of course, very much in support of female suffrage. And then after World War I, his work will take on, of course, new momentum in the early and most radical part of the Weimar Republic. The law is still in place, 175, but in Berlin it wasn't enforced. The Social Democratic majority refused to really enforce it. So Berlin did become quite a haven for gay men moving to the city from other parts of Germany too. And well, in July of 1919, as I say, Hirschfeld gets the chance to get a villa near the Reichstag and to move in and open up his new institute of his own. The Institute for Sexual Science opens in July of 1919. The building is gone now. The building would be very close to where today there's the Haus der Kulturen der Welt, the pregnant oyster building. That's pretty much where it would have stood. So it really was in the center, like a stone's throw from the Reichstag. It's an educational resource for the public, so school groups would come and visit the Museum of Sex inside the building, and there was a clinic there for consultations. There was psychotherapy offered, and also surgeries would later on be performed in that building too. I love this picture so much. It's a group of trans activists outside the building in 1921. And Hirschfeld lived there too. He lived there with his life partner, Karl Giese. And they had a whole clinical staff. They had psychiatrists, they had a gynecologist, dermatologist, endocrinologist, someone specializing in hormones. And a lot of people will actually move in there, so some for longer and some for shorter periods of time. But Walter Benjamin lived there for a while. Ernst Bloch, a Marxist philosopher, Willy Munzenberg, also a communist Reichstag deputy, will live there for a time in the building. Christopher Isherwood and W.H. Aud and the English writers will live there briefly. French novelist André Gide, Russian film director Sergei Eisenstein, they will all live in the building at various times. And two of the earliest known people to undergo surgery, gender reassignment surgery, as trans people, actually trans women in this case, they would both live in the building as well for a while. I wanted to tell you a bit about them. So first there was Dora Richter. She was first a patient at the Institute, and then she stayed living there and she worked there as a domestic servant. She is the first known trans woman to undergo a complete surgical transition. Brought up in a very poor farming family, had always identified as a girl, had been imprisoned also for cross-dressing, that was another crime, before being taken in to this institute. And then Lily Elba, whom you might know, the movie called The Danish Girl is based on her story. So she was treated in two places, in Berlin at the Sexual Science Institute and also in Dresden. And actually that's why she took the name Elba in honor of Dresden for the Elbe River, because part of her surgery took place there. But she was a Danish painter. She died at 48, as you maybe know from the movie, so she had many complications after her last surgery, but these surgeries were experimental. I won't say they were rudimentary, but they were experimental. They were the first people really to undergo surgery. I wanted to tell you quickly about another patient of Magnus Hirschfeld, someone who really means a lot to me, Karl Behr. So I only heard about Karl Behr actually by going to an exhibition called We Were Neighbors. Maybe you've been there, at the town hall in Schöneberg, and it's all about Jewish people in Schöneberg. And it's a little bit basic, you know, you just have a sort of a folder for each person, and one just caught my eye. It was Karl Behr, born Martha Behr. So of course I was totally astonished by this. And yeah, it turns out that Karl Behr was something like a trans man. It's not quite certain if he was actually intersexed. It happened quite commonly, and it still happens quite commonly, that if a child is born with indeterminate genitalia, the decision is simply to raise the child to be female. But actually, it's more complicated than that, you know. Now it is actually believed as many as 1 in 20 people is in some way intersexed. But Karl Behr was either a trans man or intersex, but certainly had to undergo a transition because he had been raised to be female and had this female name. But in his 20s, he met first with Hirschfeld. He underwent surgery in 1906. Next year, he did do something that I believe Bertolt Buttgereit couldn't do, but Karl Baer did, which was to have his birth certificate changed. So you can see that in 1907 that his birth certificate was changed from Martha to Karl, and from female to male. He was a social worker. He was an advocate for women's suffrage and the end to trafficking in women. And he emigrated to Palestine in 1938 with his wife. Then he became an accountant, and little more is known of him really after that. But he is buried in Tel Aviv under the name Karl Meyer Baer. He did write his memoir, it's sort of semi-fictional, called Memoirs of a Man's Maiden Years. So that's perhaps the first ever book by someone who was transgender. And that became a movie as well. There was a silent film made of it in 1919, but it isn't believed that exists anymore. It's not believed any copy of that survived the Nazi era. Okay, let's go back to Hirschfeld. We're coming toward the end. So, of course, Hirschfeld is seeing Germany move increasingly toward the right, and no news for you. He had himself been very badly beaten a few years earlier. Actually, he'd had his skull fractured. So Nazis or brown shirts set upon him after he'd given a speech in Munich. And he didn't want to repeat that experience. So he's also now ever more famous abroad. And as of 1930, decides to embark upon this world tour. So he leaves Germany for New York in late 1930. The problem is he finds that the American audiences are not very receptive to talking about homosexuality. So at the beginning of his visit to the States, he was actually giving two different speeches. So he would give a speech in German and then one in English. And the speeches in German were much more about homosexuality and campaigning for gay rights. And the ones in English were more about heterosexual men being more romantic. So actually in one magazine, he's called the European expert on romantic love, and he is more encouraging heterosexual couples to practice greater sexual and emotional intimacy. He did go to Chicago. That's where he'd found that gay subculture decades earlier, if you remember. So there he was quite hopeful he could talk a bit more openly about gay issues. And yeah, he did have a talk at the Dill Pickle Club in Chicago, but it was deemed to be indecent and it caused a big furore. And so he found that he wasn't really welcome anymore in the USA. Then he left the States and he traveled to Japan. Again, there he's talking more about heterosexual sex and venereal disease and about homosexuality. But he'll spend some time in Japan. Then he traveled to Shanghai, and there he met a younger man called Li Shui Tong. You'll sometimes see him called Tao Li, which means beloved disciple, because he became really Hirschfeld's, his assistant, and he was supposed to carry on Hirschfeld's legacy was the idea. But this is Hirschfeld and his other partner. So he had the partner called Giese, and now he has this other partner too called Li Shui Tong. And they start to travel together. So they would travel through Indonesia, Egypt, India as well, Palestine, and then they arrived in Greece and they spent some time there, and then they went on to France. Now, of course, in this time, things have got worse and worse in Berlin. So queer people were being ever more harassed by the police. They were returning to the closet, let's say, ever more. And it was while Hirschfeld was in France that the November 1932 elections occurred and that Hitler soon was inaugurated as the Chancellor, as you know. And very quickly after that, within 4 months of the inauguration, the Sexual Science Institute was raided by Völkisch students and by the stormtroopers. And they would take the whole library from the Sexual Science Institute, so 20,000 books, 35,000 slide photographs, magazines, thousands of patient files as well. The first repository archive of material on queer identity is destroyed by the Nazis. So they will take it, as you know, to the city center to be burned. And I would say that the book burning that happens on May 10th, 1933 is very much about Magnus Hirschfeld. It's very much intended to destroy his work forever. And of course, other books are burned there, don't get me wrong, but most of those are at least replaceable. They at least exist somewhere else. But this archive was gone forever as of that evening. Hirschfeld watched that. He saw that in a cinema in Paris with Li Shui Tong, with his lover. They saw that together in a newsreel. Now, he, like I say, never came back to Germany. He died in exile in France. So he would die in 1935. He was 67. It was actually his 67th birthday when he died. And he had named these two lovers of his, Li Shuitong and Carl Giese, to be his heirs. But they had a lot of troubles too. So Carl Giese had his French visa revoked. There are the two with Hirschfeld. After he was accused of public indecency at a bathhouse in Paris. And so he was kicked out of France. He certainly could not return to Nazi Germany. And he ended up moving in with a guy called Karl Fine in what was then Czechoslovakia, his lover. And in March of 1938, just before the takeover of the Sudetenland, Carl Giese killed himself. And Karl Fine, his lover, was murdered in the Holocaust. And Shuitong, he had hoped to be this disciple, like I say, to continue Hirschfeld's legacy, but he became very solitary after that, very restless. He studied medicine and then he studied economics. He moved between Harvard and Zurich, but he never actually finished a degree. And in 1958, he was contacted by the Berlin Regional Court about Hirschfeld's property and what to do with this inheritance, but he wanted nothing more to do with Germany, and he vanished simply from then on. It only turned out in 1993, upon his death, who he was actually. So the story goes, he was living in Vancouver, very much a recluse, very, very solitary man. And after his death, his possessions ended up in a dumpster outside his apartment, in a bin. And another neighbor passed by and noticed all of these photographs and many, many essays written in German and a plaster death mask of Magnus Hirschfeld, if you can believe it. And this neighbor was fascinated by this and took it all with him. And only in 2002, he posted then a notice online about this collection of materials that he had, to ask if anybody understood what this was and could identify it. And those items ended up belonging to the Magnus Hirschfeld Society in Berlin. So Ralph Doza, who's the director of that society, went to Toronto. He lived by then in Toronto to meet this man. And so at least we have some of this. We have these archives, what remain of them. But like I say, the Nazis destroyed, unfortunately, most of it. This is Li Shuitong and Carl Giese together. So I just want to finish, of course, not really on that note. That's a very, very sad note on which to end, but I wanted to end on the note of something being revived, actually. So there is a good, positive story on which to end. And that is that way back in 1919, Magnus Hirschfeld was involved in the first ever gay movie, a social hygiene movie, as you see, called Different from the Others. And it's all about, again, paragraph 175 and the hope to revoke it. Now, Hirschfeld assisted on the movie. He helped to write it. A lot of queer Berliners are in the movie, like the dancer Anita Berber is in it. The lead actor is Konrad Veidt, who was also the star of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. So it was a big deal to have this big name in the movie. And it is the story of a gay relationship. Like, it doesn't end very well, but, well, I'll leave it to you to watch. The point is, it's the first ever gay movie. Magnus Hirschfeld's in it. So Konrad Veidt's character comes to the Sexual Science Institute to consult with Magnus Hirschfeld because he's so troubled about his sexuality. And Hirschfeld tells him not to worry. He says, well, you can also be a respectable member of society, is the phrase that he uses. And that movie was thought to not exist in full anymore. There was a scrap of it here and a scrap of it there. But a few years ago, it was all sewn back together. So for the New York Queer Film Festival, actually, all the pieces were reunited. And now we have the movie in full. And you can watch it on Vimeo if you want to. You can just type in Different from the Others and watch this full movie. It's about 45 minutes long, and that's something which I recommend for you highly. There are a couple of things I wanted to say as well about things we can do as tour guides and places we can go to talk about this history in Berlin. But first, I will stop and see what questions you might have and what else you'd like to discuss. If there's anything that I've missed or anything you want clarity on, please feel free to ask any questions that you might have. And thank you for listening. Is that from Sharon again? Please go ahead.
No, it's not a question.
That's an old one? Okay, and then Torben, please. Hi, Torben. Or maybe Ivan, whoever's got the hands up. Torben, please go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't. It was not a question. I was applauding. That was the applause.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
That was great. Thank you, Finn.
Much
and I might have a question, but not yet.
No problem. If you do, just want to make sure that we have time for those questions if there are any, because I can talk about this all day. So at some point, kick me out. But if you do have questions, please shout.
I have a question.
Jimmy, hi.
Hey, Finn. Good to see you. Thanks for a great presentation. Really enjoyed it. Thank you. It's a question of finance. How did the Institute get financed? And also, it struck me immediately when you said he went off gallivanting, traveling from country to country to country, which then thought, well, how did he finance that? So do you know anything about how the Institute was financed? And was he born into money? Did the Institute make money, and where did it come from? So just a general question on that.
That's a really good question, Jimmy. Gosh, there I would need to research, to be honest. I think that these were wealthy people, yeah. I mean, the clients were not always so wealthy, although there is a certain, I think, middle class, at least, purview, you know, of people who have the time and the energy to go and apply for trans certificates and things. But they were not always wealthy people who saw Hirschfeld. He would have made his money, I think, primarily, I mean, yeah, inherited perhaps from his father being a very prominent doctor. He didn't grow up in stringent circumstances, but I don't know that he grew up enormously affluent. But I suppose he would have become fairly wealthy through this naturopathy clinic. I think that probably did attract very affluent people as well. And then I suppose the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, if it were funded by Germany, I would be surprised. I can't imagine they got a lot of state funding, although maybe they did. It was I mean, they called it as such, right? Scientific Humanitarian Committee. It didn't only encompass the issue of gay advocacy, but the Sexual Science Institute, I think, would have been funded only by donations and by its patients and clients. I don't think they were getting grants, let's say, but we know that it was something world recognized. So like I say, the people traveled from beyond Germany to stay there, and I'm sure they received donations in that regard. I know that they were letting people live there basically for free, and they were employing people there as well. So people like Dorothea Richter, who really didn't have money, could stay on and live and work there, and they couldn't have done that easily elsewhere. So I'm really not sure of the numbers, how much came from donations or maybe even some grants, and how much came then from Hirschfeld's own pocket. But yeah, he did become quite renowned. Like it's quite remarkable that he's really often forgotten these days, because he was, like I say, this world famous figure. I mean, he was traveling through the States. How do you make money giving lectures? I don't know. That's a good question. But somehow he managed to fund all of that, yeah. But I would need to maybe I can go to the Magnus Hirschfeld Society and ask them some research on that. That's a really good question, Jamie. I'm not entirely sure as to how much was state supported. I can't imagine, maybe in the Weimar Republic, sure, but prior to that, I can't imagine they were getting many grants, let's say. It's a really good question.
Thank you.
Okay, I have a question, but first of all, I would like to thank you for this absolutely fascinating lecture. I found it very enlightening. I wonder if you could mention, or if you could tell us something about how the reception or the memory of Magnus Hirschfeld happened, also comparing East and West Germany.
Oh, that's such a good question. Thank you. Well, I really think that Hirschfeld was quite forgotten by the end of World War II. So that's another issue, that the Weimar revival doesn't really come about for a long time after World War II. So, you know, it really takes until at least the 60s, I would say, before there's really interest again in it. And then this body of cinema, like I think about, you know, Marlene Dietrich coming back to Berlin and making that Gigolo movie with David Bowie. That's a long time afterwards, right? So it was really quashed at the end of World War II. And you know how conservative West Germany was in so many ways. And in the East, I think Hirschfeld could have potentially been someone lionized if he were more overt about his politics. He was not a communist. He was certainly a leftist. You know, he was a socialist, and he had communists around him like Willy Munzenberg. But he wasn't. I mean, East Germany wasn't that interested really either. I don't believe in gay rights. Now, on one hand, okay, they got rid of the law for sure, but a lot of that is really lip service, you know, as is, I think, their foregrounding of women in murals, but of course persists in being a rather misogynist society. And I know from older gay friends that it was very hard to grow up gay in the GDR as well. Although they said at least we weren't going to prison, although they could find some other reason to take you into their custody if they wanted to. But he wasn't a hero in either East or West Germany, let's say. Now, that there came to be a revival of a gay, in a way, subculture in West Berlin is something, but that's very specific to West Berlin. And it wasn't really the case that in other parts of West Germany, there was as much of a burgeoning gay scene as in West Berlin. So it's very small. Some of those people are survivors, or they are the next generation. Hirschfeld's memory might have been important to them had they known about him, but he didn't come back into a lot of parlance until really the last 10 years or so. So that's been really interesting for me as well, leading queer tours for really a decade, to see at the beginning almost no one had ever heard of this man, and in the recent couple of years people have started to hear about him. So it really would take, I mean, even when Li Shuitong died, nobody knew. It wasn't like, oh, that was Magnus Hirschfeld's lover. Who Hirschfeld was, it really took the turn of the century. Like, it took until about the year 2000 and maybe 2010 before there came to be a revived interest in all of this. And of course that is simply tied up with general societal developments. Perhaps one production that brought him a bit to light recently was the show called Transparent. So that's a show out of California. You might have heard about it. Won loads of Golden Globes and Emmys and things. And I worked in that show too. So we had a flashback to Magnus Hirschfeld, but it's kind of allegorical, a figure based on him. And I think that revived a lot of interest in the US on the 20s and the LGBT scene here. And then, of course, also Babylon Berlin, for instance, more recently, and the nightlife more generally. But I would say that he wasn't entirely known about until very recently. So it wasn't that he immediately, posthumously, was revived in his memory. I mean, he died 10 years before the end of the Nazi regime, of course, and they did a very good job of eliminating his work and his research. That's something that they were grotesquely good at doing. So even for queer people, that part of history was really eclipsed. People were not familiar with him until very recently. Okay, but let me see in the chat. I think there are a couple more. Heather has a question. Oh, Heather, please go ahead. Marcus.
Diesmal durfte nichts schiefgehen. Bookbeat, für mehr Abwechslung in deinem Leben.
Maybe Heather. Got to unmute Heather.
Sorry, I'm doing several things at once. I'm in the middle of a move, but I really wanted to hear. And I was hoping you could you talk for just maybe a minute on the memorial that's there? To be honest, I've only seen it from across the river, but I don't know anything about it. Who did it? It's quite recent, as far as I understand. So I was curious if you could just say a word or two about that.
Yeah, thank you.
And also, it was amazing. Thank you so much for coming out and saying yes to it.
Thank you for being here, even though you're moving. Yeah, that's something that I wanted to say. Thank you, Heather, for bringing back to that, where we can go as guides. So where the Institute stood, like I was saying, really there on John Foster Dulles Alley today is a bit out of the way, I suppose. But if you do happen to be wandering around there with groups, you could take them over there. But there is nearby there the Magnus Hirschfeld Ufer. So there is a bit of the riverbank named for him. And where the Institute used to be, there is a plaque there, yeah. And on the Ufer, there's this sculpture. I don't know much about it. It has all these sort of lovely flowers, like rainbow-colored flowers. I also don't know who put that in, to be honest. Maybe Ryan might know that. But there is a plaque where the Institute used to be, and there are stumble stones there. There's a stumble stone, for instance, to Carl Giese, to one of Hirschfeld's lovers. So if you happen to be wandering there, you could go there definitely.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. I just realized, did I go out of the screen share? I'm not sure. Oh, I did. Sorry. But I had a picture of the Ufer. But there is a Magnus Hirschfeld Ufer sign. And where else you could talk about him would be definitely at Babelplatz. If you are talking about the book burning, then I said something quite strong. I think I said it was really about Hirschfeld, the book burning, and maybe we could discuss that, and maybe you might even refute that. And it's hard to prove. The only way that I can give you kind of empirical evidence on that is to say that there was only, to my knowledge, one human image that the Nazis brought to Elbe on May 10th, 1933 for the book burning. So they brought a lot of books, they brought photos, they brought paintings, they brought film reels, but they brought a human image, and that was a bronze bust of Magnus Hirschfeld. So they had taken that out of the Institute and they put it on a big pike and they threw it into the fire. So I think it's as far as possible a kind of symbolic execution of Magnus Hirschfeld that they're doing on that night. And again, like I say, that what else they burned, of course, many copies were irreplaceable, but what is really gone forever is this library and this archive. So I think there you have a really good chance to talk about Hirschfeld. And I think that would be a marvelous thing to do, you know. I wanted to say that, like, I think often our tours, it can be a rather chauvinistic profession, I think, tour guiding. I know that when I've taken tours, I've been really quite struck sometimes. I remember taking a tour in Iceland and going to where there used to be this outdoor parliament, and the guides talking about how women were drowned there if they were adulterous or if they were just a bit too, I think he said, mouthy. And then he said something like, oh, those were the good old days, you know? And I remember, that's all that I can remember from that tour, because it so eclipsed everything else that he said, and I was so astonished by that. And of course, that's really egregious, you know? But I think that there is a sense by which there's a certain audience that will probably quite like homophobic jokes and aren't so interested really in hearing a more nuanced descriptions of queer history. And if you do talk to them at Babelplatz, they might even get a bit irritated. But I think that's something that we can work together to do. And I think it's really important also that straight people take on that mantle, you know, to tell those stories as well. So I'd really love if, yeah, you could remember him at Babelplatz. Now, there was an installation a while ago. Of course, there's the library, as we all know, but there's also a case in which they built this sculpture and had all these books there with spines, and on the spines were, I think, the Brothers Grimm, like Hannah Arendt was there, which I think is a bit misleading, but there was no Magnus Hirschfeld, you know, and that was such a striking omission because it really was about him. It really was to destroy the work of a socialist gay Jew on that night. And I don't want to say the other books are kind of collateral damage, that's a bit too strong, but it was explicitly about that. And anyway, the Nazis are so stupid. So they threw this bronze bust into the fire. I guess they thought it was going to melt at Fahrenheit 451. And we have it now. It's in the Gay Museum. So it was salvaged from the next day. Like the street sweeper came and cleaned up all the bits of books. And there was this bronze bust there with a dent in it. And so we have that today. And that's in the Gay Museum. So again, of course, it's a bit specialized. If you're taking clients there, wow, I can't imagine most people are going there unless they have a particular vested interest in gay history. But if they do, maybe you could send them over to me or to Ryan, I know, is also operating such tours, and that would be just super, you know. Otherwise, please include it on your regular tour. Like, I think if you're doing a 3 or 4 hour tour in Berlin and haven't mentioned queer history in any way, there's a bit of an omission there, you know. And I know when I auditioned for one company and talked about Hirschfeld, they said, but can you do a normal tour they really said for normal people. And I remember being so struck by that and thinking, wow, that's quite incredible. And this was a while ago, you know. I think things have changed. I think guiding's become a lot more intersectional. I feel really optimistic about that. But it would be great if you could find a way to include that in your own narrative, even if it's not with gay people explicitly, you know. Thank you. The memorial sculpture to Hirschfeld represents 6 calla lilies in different colors. See, I didn't even know that. The calla was chosen as a symbol as it has both male and female flowers on the same plant. Thank you very much. Gosh, didn't know that at all. Just thought it was very pretty. But thank you. That's great to learn. Yeah, so that's near to, it's near to that snaky diplomatic building, you know. John Foster Dulles Alley. It's near there. You'd find it. Again, like I say, it's a bit out of the way for a tour, but Babelplatz would be a great place to talk about Hirschfeld. And if you want to, you can also say at the Neue Wache, excuse me, gosh, that was the biggest cruising spot in Berlin, but it might be hard to fit that one in. Yeah, I mean, of course, queer people didn't have so many meeting spots. So they would meet in the park, in the Tiergarten, and also they would meet behind the Neue Wache. But I think in all the reverence, when we talk about that memorial, you might not find room for that particular tale. But the soldiers after work used to go back there and cruise, and many of them became sex workers as well. So if you happen to find a way to fit that in. But I would say the best place to talk about Hirschfeld is at Babelplatz for sure, on the tours. Thank you so much, everybody. I know that probably you're coming close to the end of your time. I don't want to keep you too long, but if there's anything from the association or from any more questions, I'm happy.
There are a few more raised hands.
Love to hear it. Go for it.
Finn, we have a couple of people having questions too. Yeah. So Maria, or I think they have a question because they raised their hands. Yeah.
Oren says on Mottstrasse. Yeah, of course. I mean, that's right, Oren. Yeah, there's an apothecary called the Magnus Apotheke. Exactly. I mean, if you're going around there, then you're talking about queer history for sure. You know, that's where you would go to. And exactly, there's a photo and there's a biography of him there. But there you would have so many places to bring people, like to the El Dorado, which used to be a gay bar and is now a supermarket. There are stumblestones galore. I mean, that's what the whole queer Berlin tour that I'm doing is all about, you know, going around Nollendorfplatz, around that area. So of course, if you're over there, there's so much, but in the city center, it's a little bit more difficult. But yeah, exactly, Aaron, you're right. Very good point. Mottstrasse is the central street for sure. But love to hear the other questions, please.
What I was wondering about, because you mentioned Dora Richter and Lily Elbe being the first reassignment operations. Do you know which one, the other way around from female to male, which was the, and if that was at the Magnus Hirschfeld Institution as well?
Super question, Maria. Yeah, I mean, again, when I say the first, it is a little bit of a European imperial statement. So, for instance, we know that there were even people called Hijra who live today in India and Pakistan who are not quite trans women. They identify as Hijra. It's like a third gender identity. But we know that, I mean, that has been an identity recognized in those places, in those territories for many, many centuries. And we know that some of those people underwent surgeries like castration rituals, let's say. So it's not like going to a clinic and having a doctor and having an anesthetic, but they would undergo surgery of some kind. So when I say that it's the first surgery, like I say, that is something to be mindful of in my rhetoric, that's a quite colonial European statement. But absolutely, I said it there that the first surgeries in a clinic happened in Berlin. So Dora Richter is the first of whom we know. Lily Elbe followed. I think Lily Elbe eclipsed Dora Richter a bit because of the movie and so on. I mean, also that Dora Richter was this poorer person, working class person. It's a less glamorous story maybe. Dora Richter was murdered, by the way, when the stormtroopers came to the building that day in May 6, 1933. She was murdered in the building. Yeah, she's the first of whom we know. And she also had, I mean, she had the operation, so she was killed later, but she had survived all of that. Whereas Lily Elbe, she died very tragically. So they had actually tried with her a new operation that Dora Richter had not attempted. And that is still not possible to do. And that was to implant a uterus into her body, into Lily Elbe's body. So they think that they might be able to do that one day for trans women, but it's not yet possible. So they tried it with her, and because her body rejected it, she died of complications due to that. So that was first Dora and then Lily Elbe. The first trans man of whom we know to have surgery is, I believe, Colbert. But that is a little bit hazy because Colbert's memoir is partially fictitious. It's a kind of novel memoir. And also because I believe that he was in some way intersexed, which means then that the surgery is a little bit different. I mean, there are all kinds of different surgeries that trans people can have. But this surgery to create a penis from effectively nothing, as in from either abdominal or usually it's abdominal skin, or it's the skin of the forearm because it's the most sensitive skin. So these days that is possible to do, but that was not a surgery pioneered for trans people. It was pioneered for men who were not trans. Actually, it comes about first during World War I because of all the injuries that people sustained. And they started to then find this way to repair or to create male genitalia from other parts of the body. It's still relatively rare that trans men undergo it, but some people do. So whatever surgery Colbert had, I'm honestly not entirely sure what it was. I think that it might have been more like a reassignment of what he had, let's say. I mean, also it also comes to be kind of crass to talk about this in some ways, but I think because he was in some way intersex, it wasn't a phalloplasty. It's called phalloplasty. It was not a phalloplasty that he had. That's something that came about later for, like I say, what we call cisgender, as in non-trans, so cisgender men. And that's something else too. Trans medical treatment, apart from what Hirschfeld did, was basically the treatment for cisgender people that trans people then also got. So hormone replacement therapy, for example, was not invented for trans people. It was invented for cis people with hormone deficiencies, and then trans people could benefit from it. So to answer your question, I would say it's Colbert, but exactly which surgery he had, I'm honestly not all that sure. And what I can say too is that a disciple of Magnus Hirschfeld was a guy called Harry Benjamin, as he's known, because he moved to the States, and he then became the next, like he was the pioneer of the next generation of trans medical care. And a lot of the time, even a very renowned trans historian called Susan Stryker, her book about trans history begins with Harry Benjamin in the post-war climate, So really, it is until recently that Hirschfeld was just omitted from the narrative. But Harry Benjamin started all that in the USA, and then he worked with other trans people, like very famously an army veteran called Christine Jorgensen, as she went through her transition too. Trans men, not so many. Like we know of a few in the post-war era who obtained surgeries, but actually not that many did, until more recently, of whom we know at least. Like it might be that they did and they didn't talk about it, like they were not prolific or prevalent, prominent people. But essentially, trans men often would have mastectomy surgery, which is anyway something, like I say, not intended, really pioneered for them. Genital surgery for trans men is still relatively rare, so it's a bit hard to garner information on that. All I can say is that even when I started medical transition, which was about 15 years ago, I had a diagnosis which was Harry Benjamin syndrome. So that's what they used to say, Harry Benjamin syndrome, and that's not a term in parlance anymore. But he would have been the one to pick up the thread of Hirschfeld in the 50s in the USA. That's what I can say. And I could name a few people: Carl Baer, a guy called Lou Sullivan, who was a trans man in the 70s, but honestly, not that many. It's really not until the turn of the century that you start to see specific clinics be opened for trans people, and really trans-specific doctors begin to work. And we have one in Berlin too. There's one in Berlin called Viro, V-I-R-O. That's in Neukölln, it's just by the airport, actually, just on the Schillerkiez. And they're not doing operations there, but it's a clinic, and that's the first place that's really specializing in trans medical care, like to pick up Hirschfeld's legacy in a way. But it's like there's this massive gap, between the 30s and really 20 years ago, like a huge gap where people have to become very isolated. It's just certain places, like around Harry Benjamin, for example. Sorry, Maria, that was a very long answer to your simple question.
Thank you. Thank you for this lecture. It was brilliant, really good.
Oh, my total pleasure. Yeah, it's a real privilege to be able to talk about all this, and I really do appreciate, that you're curious about it. So thanks a lot.
I have a question, actually. I mean, we talked about it a little bit, that he had been forgotten through the years, but what was the sexologist point of view? I mean, we know that, like, in the 60s in America, Alfred Kinsey and all his, theories and stuff. So how much, to which extent did the, sexologists refer to Magnus Hirschfeld, or could actually, take his scientific research seriously? How much did they say, okay, well, it's nonsense, it's already like pre-war stuff? And so what was the relations of sexologists from the 60s to today to his research and his scientific kind of studies that he did?
Oh, that's such a good question. I really don't know of any moment in which Kinsey explicitly pays tribute to Hirschfeld in any way. I'm not a scholar of Kinsey. I'm really not sure. I know that he was mostly concerned with heterosexual paraphilias or fetishes, and also with his scale of sexuality. So he certainly acknowledged that there were people who were asexual and people who were explicitly, overtly homosexual or heterosexual, and that most people fell somewhere in between the two poles. But I don't know of a moment in which he actually writes about Hirschfeld, and I could be wrong. He could refer to him at some point. There I would need to research, and that's something I'd like to do. But I think that it was like, even Harry Benjamin, I don't think, spoke very much about Hirschfeld. I think it really was the matter of another generation that, there was that gap of really 30 years, I suppose, and that was operating in a totally different cultural climate. Like even Hirschfeld himself was acting a bit more like an early Kinsey when he was in the States, when he understood he had to modify his narrative. But I'm really not sure if Kinsey ever refers explicitly to Hirschfeld in his work. That's a really, really good question. I would really like to explore that. I should say that Hirschfeld was a bit revived, I guess, because there was a movie about him made in the 80s called The Einstein of Sex by Rosa von Braunheim. But I think that I don't know if it really got international traction. I'm sure they knew about it. I mean, I'm sure Kinsey knew about Hirschfeld, but I don't think that he was much in their parlance. No, I really don't think so. I think probably his ideas on gender, so that there's sexuality and then gender, right? And I think that his idea on gender of the third sex was probably something that they just weren't yet ready to talk about. I mean, you start to see, of course, a trans activist movement really growing up from the late 60s on. I think the word transgender is coined. It's coined by Virginia Prince. I think it's 1969, something like that. You know, they start to talk about this in the late 60s, early 70s. But again, somehow then it's sort of too late to pick up Hirschfeld's legacy. It's curious. He's really forgotten, you know. I mean, think the people around him, his patients, many of them hadn't survived the Nazi era, or if they had, they became quite reclusive, or they had gone to other countries like Karl Behr did, or like Bertolt Buttgereit just went on with their lives and didn't talk about it very much. But it seems like he just was not in the discourse, you know, until really 20 years ago, 10 years ago. It's quite remarkable. But I have to go back to Kinsey and see. I could read his original sources, but I nothing strikes me that he referred to Hirschfeld explicitly. I don't think so. Could be wrong, but I don't think so.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Great question. Something I have to research. Okay, everybody. There are more hospitals in Berlin specializing in transgender surgery. For instance, Elisabeth Krankenhaus Tiergarten. Ah, super. I don't know that one. There is also one in Potsdam called Sans-Souci, which is like the pioneer of do as many surgeries at once in one go as you possibly can. So that for some is quite a difficult idea, but yeah, I know that they try to reduce the numbers of surgery necessary, but it is quite traumatic, I think, upon the body. So yeah, they also do that. I mean, I don't know if you want to hear about my personal story, but I only had one surgery. I only had a chest surgery, and when I went to consult there, they kept showing me all these photos of their phalloplasty results. And I was telling them, yeah, it looks great, but I really just want to do the chest surgery. And then they were really perturbed by that. And they were like, well, are you really trans if you don't want this as well? But that was also a long time ago. I think things have become a lot more sophisticated in that time. And I went to a clinic in Hamburg. But yeah, of course, there must be places in Berlin. Gosh, Elizabeth. Okay, I didn't know that. But Viro is a place that I've been, and they're really, really fantastic and very sensitive. I mean, not all their clients are trans or queer people. It's a local clinic. They're like house arts, you know, like GPs, but they are particularly switched on to trans and queer issues. But yeah, Berlin would be the place to go for sure. But that was fun. I also remember that when I first came here to apply for health insurance, that was really fun. And I went to have a consultation, and at the end of it, I was so naive, and what would you call them? Gosh, the representative, you know, he said to me, oh, you don't have any pre-existing conditions, do you? And then I said, well, I am transgender. I don't know if that makes a difference. And he kind of looked at me like this rictus, and he said, what's that? And I mean, I ended up in his office, like going through Wikipedia on trans people. And at that time, really the only very prominent trans man was a porn star called Buck Angel. So we happened upon him, and he was there like, wow. And then he told me, I don't think we can help you. I'm so sorry. And then he called me in the evening and he said, oh, I've been thinking about you all day. Like, I really want to help you. You know, I really love Ireland. Like, he told me a lot about how much he loved Ireland. And he said, I'd love to help you. Okay, I think what you can do is go to England, change all your documents, like retransition, be a woman, move to Berlin, and then get health insurance, and then we'll have to pay for it. Like, that would be a solution. It was quite touching. You know, I told him, oh, thank you. It's really a lovely idea, but I don't think it's going to work, though. But yeah, I mean, it's not perfect here either. Like, there are problems here too. Of course, people are sometimes not treated with great respect. As we know, it depends how much you know, if you're paying for your private or all that stuff. I mean, the health insurance system, well, there are also problems here too. But I think in general, there are clinics in Berlin, and I think it is generally possible. And yeah, there was a case a while back about a trans girl who wanted to take hormone blockers. So people have a lot of, I think, misinformation on hormone blockers. They don't do much but stop a puberty from beginning. So because she didn't want to go through a male puberty, she wanted to take these hormone blockers, and she was very, very young, and she ended up in court, and that was in the time of Overreit as well, and he got involved in it too. So there are moments when the Berlin medical professionals are not that well informed either, but it seems to be that there couldn't be many better places to be. So it's a great time to be here. And I think when tourists come back, then you'll see a lot of LGBT people do visit Berlin. And that's about half of the work that I'm doing anyway, is with LGBT clients in some way, whether they're taking an actual queer tour or whether they just want to take regular tour, but in Mitte, but hear about queer history incorporated in that too. And of course, there's the Gay Memorial. I should mention that's another place you could take them. William says, I wondered if you could say a few sentences about the Institute today. There is one, who runs it and what are they working on and how did the reincarnation of the Institute and Hirschfeld in general happen? I don't know so much about that.
Can I answer this question? Sorry that I interrupt like this, because my question is related. Maybe you can answer both. I also wanted to know if you know about this Queeres Kulturhaus and if they are related to this institute.
I'm honestly not sure. Gosh, now I realize I'm just talking about dead people all the time. But I think that there is this Magnus Hirschfeld Institute, and I think that I know that they obtained the remains of his archive, like I said, a few years ago in the 2000s. But what exactly they're up to, I'm not quite sure. I'm working at the Gay Museum, and they do an awful lot, of course, to revive that. They had an exhibition on Hirschfeld recently. They have that, that bust is always there, like in the foyer, like there's Magnus Hirschfeld. But what exactly this institute does, I'm really not sure. It's on soon to be renamed Mohrenstrasse. It's there. I've never been in the building. I'm not quite sure what they get up to in there, but I should learn that, I suppose. I think that they are, like a Verein that keeps up his memory. And I'm sure that they do some form of activist work, but it's not any kind of clinic anymore. That's not what they're doing there. It's more like a historical society, I think. And how did the reincarnation of the Institute and Hirschfeld in general happen? Again, I think it really just comes about with general loosening of attitudes and general progressiveness in the 21st century about queer history and more interest in it, and queer people looking for their ancestors and for the first time obtaining information that their ancestors did exist. So big moment would be, like I say, when Ralph Doza went to meet this chap who had taken the property, the possessions of Liu Shuitong that Hirschfeld had left him. That was something. But of course, that's not alone, sufficient. But new internet discourse, I think, I guess it would have been, though, finding that archival material that brought specifically Hirschfeld back to life. But queer history came to life in general in the last couple of decades with online, just a podcast, so on, about trans people now in history. One's called Journeys Through Space and Time, I think. I really have to spend less time on dead people, I suppose, and more time what's going on today. But they are doing one on trans people today, and then, and so it's ever more possible to learn about this. And then Transparent, I guess, made a big difference too. Like, that was nice to work on. And it seemed to be that a lot of people watched that. And so I guess they learned about him through that. Bit vague, bit nebulous, I know. I hope it makes some sense. Okay, everybody. Thank you. I need to know what exactly they're doing. Maybe I'll just go in there one day and knock on the door and ask them what they're up to there on Mohrenstrasse, which hopefully won't be called that any longer. But what they do today, I think, is, like I say, more like a historical Verein. And the queer life of Berlin today is another topic for another day, but there's just so much going on. It's on, I'm just Googling it now, actually. Excuse me, it's on Taubenstrasse, so it's around the corner from me. It's on Taubenstrasse. What exactly they do, though, you have to go and ask them yourself. Or I will do it. Founded in 2011 by the Federal Republic of Germany, etc., the foundation's goals are to remind society of Magnus Hirschfeld, to support educational and research projects, and to fight against the discrimination of homosexuals in German society. That's what they say on their website today. Sounds good. Okay, everybody, thanks a million. Are there any more questions that I didn't answer in my rambling in nebulous way?
Has raised his hand for a long time.
I think from the beginning, though. I'm not sure if that was just a computer blip.
And Oren, any questions from your side? Turn on your mic.
I've already asked it.
Okay.
Then everyone, thanks so much.
Okay.
I think Ivan's hand was up from the start. Hopefully not an emergency.
Anyway.
Thanks so much, everyone. Really appreciate it. If you have any more questions, just email them to me and I can research them and work on them and try to answer them if I don't know the answer immediately. But thank you so much for this time together, and my pleasure.
Thank you. It was really, really interesting and fascinating.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
It was really good.
My pleasure.
Thanks, great. Appreciate it.
Have a super day.
Thank you, Finn.
See you next time.